Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm the chair. My name is Marit Hansen. I come from the Data Protection Authority Schleswig-Holstein. That's a state in Germany. And I'm the Deputy Privacy and Information Commissioner there. And I have the honor to chair this session here on identity systems, informational self-determination. It was not our invention, this title, so we had to fill in now, or we will fill in what we think what this means. But I think everybody of us has a pretty good idea what he or she thinks about that. We will see whether we have some common view on that. I make it short. I think the boss here will not be the chair, but the moderator. And first of all, I'd like everybody here on the panel to say a few words about, what is important to know. You can decide yourself. And then the moderator will explain the format, and then we will go on from there. So, Elliot.
So I'm Elliot Schrage. I'm the Vice President of Public Policy, Communications and Marketing at Facebook. And what's important to know about me is I am wearing my flak jacket.
So this is just introductions. Is that okay? My name is Michael Furtick. I'm the founder and CEO of Reputation Defender. We are not as famous as Facebook, so I'll tell you what we do. We protect privacy and reputation digitally. We have products that run from free, that will fix your privacy settings on Facebook, for example, or check your privacy online and fix some of it, to about $10 a month up to $100 a year to protect your reputation or your privacy on the internet. We have customers now in just over 100 countries. We're based in Silicon Valley.
I'm Kim Cameron. I'm the architect of identity at Microsoft. And I forgot my flak jacket, so...
Do you understand well?
Yeah, can you hear? Okay.
And I'm Lee Tian. I'm a senior staff attorney with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We are a US-based, San Francisco-based civil liberties organization that focuses on the internet.
I'm Malcolm Crompton. I'm a jack of all trades. I was once Privacy Commissioner of Australia for a while. I'm currently on the board of IAPP, and at the moment I run a company called Information Integrity Solutions. I am also the moderator of this session today. Forgot that.
And therefore you're allowed to say a few words on the format.
As moderator, I will basically be conducting the orchestra for the rest of the 90 minutes allocated to us. But we have, in a period of discussion amongst ourselves, tried to work out a format that is highly interactive. And in particular, we set out to try and make this session PowerPoint free, and we nearly got there. But we are actually going to see a few PowerPoint slides. More importantly, we are trying to run the session so that each of us makes very crisp opening remarks. We will then spread out to a panel discussion amongst the panel, but we will actually try and keep a good slab of time for audience question and audience participation as well. So we're going to do probably 20 minutes each of panel discussion, and then 20 minutes of audience discussion, joining the discussion. One of the things that we were also trying to do is to see how well we could get this discussion going outside the room. So if nothing else, there is a Twitter hashtag which is #PrivacyGenerations, which everybody should be using by now as they tweet out this conference. And if anybody who is out there tweets in their question via that hashtag, I guess somebody in the room will pick it up and pass it on as a question. I don't know if there's a corresponding Facebook or other technology platform that people can use, but there's no reason why we should keep this just as a closed session. You will also, if you're looking at the conference website, privacyconference2010.org, when you're looking at the program page, you will be able to see that each program subject area has a clickable heading in there. So that if you click on the heading for our session, you'll actually see we've created a series of resources for this particular session for you to click on and read later on. And one of the papers that you will find there in particular is a background paper that has been prepared especially for the conference, and it's intended to be what I would call a crossover document, so that it's utterly unsatisfactory for the technologists because there's not enough technology in there, and it's utterly unsatisfactory for the lawyers because it's not a legal document either. But hopefully it informs everybody a little bit on trying to think through what is essentially a hydra-headed monster problem. As soon as we solve one bit of identity, we create three more. And that is what we're going to discuss today. As Marit pointed out, we have actually got in the title of this session almost an enigmatic title. It says identity systems, and that sounds pretty familiar territory to the technologists until you read the rest, when it says informational self-determination. There is at least one person in this room who knows what that means, but not many of us. And that's why we're going to ask Marit Hansen to speak first, because it is actually a concept invented in Germany, and we are going to ask Marit to take us through the concept of informational self-determination before we then go around the table for opening remarks. Marit.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. So I'm also, sometimes I'm waving because I have the exception for the PowerPoint slides, very few only. I'm waving to the slide guy, and it works perfectly. Thanks a lot. So this is a picture here of pictures, and the bits of identity were already mentioned a little bit by Malcolm. We've also discussed the segmented identity. We call them also partial identities. And so identity has many facets, and also identity systems have many facets. And what is now the fuss with all this kind of informational self-determination? In fact, it's a translation from a German word. It's a right to informational self-determination, das Recht auf informationelle Selbstbestimmung. It's coined by lawyers. Nobody would have guessed. And it's not too bad. No. It's really our baseline in Germany, what we are doing our data protection concepts upon. And so we see here the famous, for Germany at least famous, census decision of the German Federal Constitutional Court. And the basic sentence here is, the right to informational self-determination is a right that warrants the capacity of the individual to determine in principle the disclosure and use of his or her personal data. And for Germany it was very new to have this phrasing here. It's a little bit similar to what Alan Weston said plenty of years before already, the right of the individual, when he explained right to privacy, to decide what information about himself should be communicated to others and under what circumstances. I think the Western definition is more on communication from your own self, so you decide what you communicate, while the German one is also, well, focusing on the data subject, so an individual that sometimes is not asked, or is asked but in fact has not all the choices when to give information. For example, if in here it was about the census, if the state asks, the government asks, give me all your data, you may say no, but you may also then have very many difficulties, or even may face imprisonment. So here we have something which was really a baseline for German privacy protection or data protection. And what is this? Isn't it similar to notice and choice, or knowledge and choice, as it is coined here at the conference? And I think there's more to it. And only as a repetition for all Europeans here in the room, the processing of personal data in the European framework is admissible only if permitted by legal provision. You need to have a law, a regulation, or with consent. And we don't only think of being informed and then, well, don't understand what is happening or don't have the right choices, but it only makes sense in this informational self-determination idea if we have a rule that privacy by default is set. And I have a few things here listed: opt-in instead of opt-out, data minimization, separation of context. I think this one is very important to the identity topic. And we have also the data subject rights, for example, to access the data, to rectification, to erasure if there's something wrong or the data should not be there. A precondition, this was also pointed out by several speakers, is that the people know what is happening, the transparency, and not in the sense of the technical transparency that you don't know anymore what is happening, but really that you have clarity on the data processing. And I think this is not very interesting for most of people except for computer scientists, what is really happening to the data, but the consequences. This is often overlooked also in our region. Okay, so if we get this together, I think we discuss here identity systems to support or implement informational self-determination, and the questions I would like to be tackled, but Malcolm is the moderator: privacy by default, transparency, do we have it enough, is it sufficient, and we will see whether this is really something which promotes, so identity systems promoting informational self-determination, or whether it may also be, well, harmful or not realizing, not really doing what we expect from the privacy side, but perhaps even creating a false sense of security and privacy. So these were my opening remarks. I wait for the general slide, please. Thanks. And Malcolm, your turn.
Thank you. Well, taking it from there before we go to each of our panellists, if you have a look at the paper, the background paper prepared for today, you'll see that there is a theme in there, which is that we have been struggling with concepts around identity and identity management in technological expression of it for some time now. And there are some interesting background assumptions in the way many of these solutions have been developed, but the most important one is that there is actually somewhere a concept of a single source of truth, and that all we have to do is to plumb the single source of truth, and the person who we have then fully identified, we can do business with them. Unfortunately, it leads to another product, which is that you have, by using the single source of truth, created a digital god. A digital god will decide when you are brought into digital existence. A digital god will decide when you are taken out of digital existence, and a digital god will keep a very close eye on everything you do in between those two events. Very godlike. What we have been watching over the last 10 years or so is essentially a series of discomforts with that kind of concept. How can we rebalance the arrangement away from a digital god system where something that's not you decides whether you are in digital existence or not, and hence allowing in particular informational self-determination. The paper that we wrote brings out some of the risks that come from setting things up that way, such as individuals lose control over their digital identities. There is often poor usability or lack of interoperability between the various digital gods. There is often lack of recognition that people have different ways of living in different parts of their lives. A parent is different from a brother or a sister, is different from a boss, is different from a worker, is different from the people you might go to church with, and so forth. We've all discussed that many times, but we've not been able to express that very well in the digital world. And often, in the way most digital systems, identity management systems have been built in the past, is that should anything go wrong with the arrangements, it's the individual's fault and they have to fix it without anybody else's help. So how do we rebuild systems so that we have a much more balanced arrangement between the individual and the world with which they're interacting digitally? User-centric identity management has come out as the phrase to try and express that. And the laws of identity is developed in particular by Kim Cameron, and the blogging process that he went through 3 or 4 or 5 years ago was one way of bringing out many of the aspects of what we might think of as user-centric identity management. But it has been, we're seeing the thinking evolve further since then, and you'll see some thoughts about that in the paper. But much more importantly, we are now seeing some technologies developing that will allow us to give expression to those requirements for user-centric identity management. And I think that is the major breakthrough that we're watching right now. The current couple of years, the next few years, will see very significant change in how we deliver on user-centric identity management. We are going to ask Kim, in fact, to give us a presentation as the last speaker now on one of those kinds of solutions. But what I'm going to do next is ask 3 of our other speakers, Lee Tien, Elliot Shraj and Michael Furtick, each to tell us about the perspectives that they're coming from in how one achieves informational self-determination. I'm going to basically go around the table in this direction and therefore start with Lee and ask if Lee would like to give us some remarks from his perspective as an advocate for the individual in society.
Thanks a lot, Malcolm. One of the things that the core points that Malcolm made in his white paper was that one of the core dangers of ID management systems is their tendency to put power in the hands of entities that are not us. And so I want to take a very privacy and civil liberties perspective here, but not just in the abstract, also to sort of filter that through the lens of a current ID management proposal that's playing out in the United States, what's called the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, or NSTIC for short, and talk a little bit about how that illustrates some of the points that Malcolm has made, and just to comment on some of the issues it raises. And I think the first problem when you talk in such grand terms as a national strategy for trusted identities in cyberspace is an overemphasis on the issue of identity in the first place. At least that's the way I see it from a civil liberties perspective. Because the fact is that showing identity, having to assert who you are, and having to be authenticated is just not something that is necessary in many, many spheres of everyday life. And then given the impact of identification on constitutional or fundamental values such as privacy and freedom of expression or freedom of association, we ought to be thinking very, very hard about when we ever actually ask people to assert or prove their identities in the first place. In the United States, for instance, it's very clear that the right to free speech includes the right to speak anonymously. And of course, in the United States, we're talking about constitutional rights that are good against government action. And so there are a lot of areas in which we basically say, well, if you decide whether or not to be attributed to a particular statement, that's as much an aspect of the content of what you say as the actual sense of the sentence. And similarly, there's a very strong strand of privacy that's located in the First Amendment as well, having to do with, say, your membership in associations. And this has come out in cases involving, say, government inquiries into whether or not folks were members of the NAACP, civil rights organizations in the South, during times when obviously race was a very, very serious issue, and membership in one of these groups was something that would stigmatize you and quite possibly lead to violence against you. So these are the kinds of things that, from my perspective, are very much at stake when we talk about forcing people to associate themselves with an identity. And also, of course, it's not just going to be a matter of being coerced by government, but because there's always a tendency for these kinds of systems to promote or to create a kind of legitimacy for doing it in the commercial sphere where it might not be strictly required, but is probably going to happen anyway. So the general point is that this is not simply a question of technical implementation. You have to ask normative questions about the scope or the jurisdiction of any kind of an ID management system. And you have to ask normative questions about how it's going to be designed or architected. And we speak a lot about privacy by design, but really in many ways an identity system can be thought of as a kind of surveillance by design. And if that's the case, then we need to also be designing it with the concept of safety margins, some kind of prophylaxis, thinking about how, if it can be used as a form of social surveillance of tracking us, then how are we going to design it so it will pose or mitigate those kinds of risks. And the present version of the NSTIC, the national strategy we're seeing in the United States, really fails on that kind of level because it's very confused about all of these points. It uses the example of someone who's going to blog anonymously, and yet at the same time talks about how they'll do so using their state-issued, online identity. And to me, that's almost a contradiction in terms, unless you're doing a really, really good job of creating this online identity that allows you to be truly anonymous, and it's in the hands of the state. It leaves me scratching my head. It mentions the idea that I think we'll probably talk about later, and which Marita talked about the other day, attribute credentials. Credentials that do not say who you are, but will say that you're a member of this group, of a certain age, or a certain, you're a veteran or something like that. And yet, in mentioning this, it doesn't at all refer to the great amount of research literature, the work of Stefan Brands or Kamenisch, all these folks who have been doing a lot of research in this area, and you wouldn't know that this was a question that people had actually been thinking about from reading this strategy. I mean, I could go on, but there are, a lot of issues that it raises, and it's difficult to see the kind of necessary depth. The one other thing I'll say here, and then I'll stop, is there's a lot of confusion about purpose, and in a sense, I would say sort of the problem of purpose overload in the national strategy. I mean, it does not make clear what problem it is trying to solve. Rather, it points to a great many problems. Identity theft, cybersecurity, commerce, so on and so forth, and then proposes a lot of things about identity management and trust, which, maybe they'll solve them, but there's no attempt to really draw some clear lines as to what it's going to do. That sort of thing not only doesn't inspire confidence in the clarity of thought or of design, but it also makes you worry when some of those purposes include law enforcement or cybersecurity, that the folks who are designing the system aren't necessarily on our side. After all, being able to identify people is very useful if you are in law enforcement. And so if I'm thinking I want a system that's designed to actually protect privacy, to guard against the possible biases of surveillance, it doesn't make me feel particularly warm and fuzzy to know that those folks are also deeply embedded in the building of these kinds of systems. So I think we have to be really careful when we look at this in a multi-agency kind of situation where the government is trying to promote an identity management system, and yet they are not being especially clear, as not being especially cogent about all the risks, and in fact saying things that make you wonder if they even understand the risks. That's something to worry about, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. William Heath, who writes for a blog called idealgovernment.something-or-other.org or .com, idealgovernment.com, quite some time ago thought out loud about, is government playing at least two roles? One of them essentially a role that is to provide services to you, and the other one is a role that is to provide services to everybody else in the form of policing and other forms of community order. But the government has to be very careful when it's trying to achieve both of those objectives with the one tool. And I think that's much of what you were saying, Lee. And hopefully some of the technology conversation will try and answer what you've talked about. And one of our technologies is in fact in the form of Michael Furtick, who is here, as you can see, from Reputation Defender. Technology. You're a technology. We're all technologies. Michael, would you like to?
Yes, happily.
Would you like to give us some introductory remarks?
I will press play. I will play. Okay. So it's a very exciting question. Identity systems. Short version: to establish a successful identity system that is successful in respect of its ability to protect the identity and ultimately privacy of its users, you have to go about creating and introducing friction into the process of collecting and using data about that person. You have to reintroduce friction into the process of collecting and using data about that person. This is a difficult process. The basic promise of all technology ever has been the reduction of friction. The basic promise of all technology has been the reduction of friction. And now we have a job before us, which is how to actually introduce friction to the process of collecting and using data about individuals. It's a very tough job. I am actually more worried about little brother than I am about big brother. Lee and other very capable people like Lee are focused on, at least partly, on what the government can and may do to each of us, perhaps because I am confident that they will succeed in caring for us in that way, or perhaps because I believe this is a little bit more of a Cold War problem than the problem that's really in front of us, or perhaps because I think the problem of little brother is bigger. I think mostly about the problem of little brother. Little brother is everybody who's not the government that's got a lot of data about you, and that the number of little brothers is growing very fast, and it is proliferating without your permission. You have been opted in, even to websites and to databases that you have never heard of in all the countries in which we live. And that bothers me. It bothered me enough to start a company to try to stop it. And we're doing it. So the problem with little brother is that they proliferate, they collect data, they buy and sell data from one another, they observe you in your everyday life, they build databases, and also they produce databases, some of which independently of one another are actually quite innocent, but when taken together in a mashup or a combination have very unwelcome consequences for each of us in our lives. An example of this from the US, there's a company in the US called Netflix, which is an online movie rental business. And they did a contest, they held a contest to see if you could propose a way to improve their recommendation engine. If you like movies by Clint Eastwood, you might also like movies with, I don't know, a certain actor in them, Dustin Hoffman. I don't know if that's true, but let's imagine that's true. And this contest ran for several years and was never won by anybody, but last year it was won by a group. And also another group in that contest reported that they were able to take the anonymized, perturbated, which just means anonymized data sets released by Netflix for the purposes of this contest, mash them up, overlay them with other publicly available databases, meaning data that they could scrape and otherwise put together, and find out who was gay and who was straight, down to the atomic level of a person. My own company has shown that 6 out of 7 times, we do not do this publicly, we do not do this outside the 4 walls of our firewall-protected headquarters in Silicon Valley. I'm on the record saying that very emphatically. But we have shown 6 out of 7 times with a name and an email address, we will get your 9-digit social security number, all 9 digits in the US. It's very possible today to mash up a huge amount of data about each of us and to then find information and to collect information and profile each of us in a way that we never thought possible. And even good actors, well-meaning actors who are running companies that provide interesting and useful services to us may be party to this problem creation unknowingly and unwittingly because they create data set A, someone else creates data set B, and then someone else yet again mashes up A and B to create a very detailed profile about you. The only way to stop this is to reintroduce friction to the process of the data collection, the data aggregation, and the data use. And I also want to note that, so I live in Silicon Valley, very much in the startup kind of scene. The rate of change is accelerating. And this may sound obvious, but I want to emphasize it. The rate of change at the companies we're talking about and the ways in which we can have our privacy, our identities violated or breached is changing and it's accelerating. So I've spent 100% of my professional time thinking about this problem for the last 4 years, as many do in this room. There are 100 people in our company. We all spend a huge amount of time thinking about this privacy question. And we are regularly surprised every couple of weeks by some new way that our privacy and our identities can be breached and violated. So every so often, every couple of weeks, there's a new way, there's a new app, there's a new platform for apps, there's a new website where all of us can be compromised. Given all this landscape, I'd like to close with a note, hopefully for the regulators and policymakers in the room, which is to say that companies like mine, and right now in the world, although I say so myself, it's basically mostly just us, but there are others that are coming. Technologies are coming to solve these problems. We must, I think, make regulation, light regulation. We must make legislation. We must make harmonization of the legislation that exists. But technology solutions are coming. I'd like to talk more about them later on. But also, importantly for the regulators in the room, I urge you especially, this is probably the non-obvious point on this one, I urge you especially not to regulate the last 10 years. The internet is not just media companies. And I think this sounds obvious once you say it, but I want to say it very clearly. Internet is not just media companies. Internet 1.0 has been mostly media companies. So 90%, call it, of the $1 trillion in wealth that we've seen created from the internet, if you set aside the hardware companies and if you set aside the ISPs, 90% of the $1 trillion has been from media businesses. And that is not going to be true of the next trillion. The next trillion is going to be pay for play. It's going to be a lot more business of different kinds of business models from media businesses. So I hope that we neither treat the media companies as the kings we may not depose, nor as the bad or good actors of the future, because they are not going to be the dominant players of the future. We must enable a framework that allows companies like mine, but not just mine, mostly mine, but not just mine, to grow and to thrive, because we are providing technical solutions to these problems that may also be solved in part by law and by regulation, but may also be solved in part by our technological innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So here's a man who thinks he's got some of the solution. Here's a man who's been accused of much of the problem. But he doesn't think he is at all. I'd like to give to you Elias Shraj from Facebook, and he would like to make some remarks in regard to perhaps some of the things already said in the conference, but certainly in regard to informational self-determination.
Thank you, Malcolm. So I would say Michael has essentially stolen my conclusion that Merit raised in her opening remarks. I want to preface it by saying, though, that I don't think people at Facebook, and I don't think the people who use Facebook, view our company and our service as an identity system. The purpose, to go back to what Lee was saying, the purpose of Facebook is not to be an identity system. The purpose is to help people share information with the people they care about and they want to connect to. Clearly, an element of that is establishing identity, but the purpose is sharing and connecting. And I think that's a really important point that will become, essential as I go through some of the themes that connect to how Merit defined informational self-determination. So 3 points. First, and I think it's an obvious point, but I think it's essential to emphasize, and that is identity systems can be voluntary or mandatory. And there are different responsibilities and different requirements and different expectations. Lee gave a really interesting presentation and discussion about an approach that might include a mandatory kind of information system. Facebook is a voluntary system. No one is required to join it. No one is required to participate in it. And I think, therefore, the expectations of usage and the balances that we draw or help the people who use our service draw to determine what they want to do and how they want to use that service is profoundly impacted by the fact that it's voluntary. People choose to come and become a part of it, just as many people choose not to. Second essential element is that ours is an identity system that is controlled by the individual user. And as part of that control, we give and ensure that people have the ability to control what they share and when. And I want to mention a couple of specific kinds of elements of informational self-determination that I think have been perhaps somewhat confusingly presented by others at the conference over the past few days. One element of that is you have to have the ability to delete your information. Anything you add to the service, you control, you should be able to delete. And of course, we provide that service. It's not something new. You've always been able to do that on Facebook. You have to have the ability to take that information away, so that if you want to share it or take it to another place, you have to have that ability. In 2007, we introduced something called Facebook Platform, which essentially enables people to take whatever information they put as part of our service to any application they may choose or that may develop to share it with. Similarly, something in fact we just released recently is the idea and the ability to download all of your data, so that if you want to save it as a backup on your hard drive or take it to some other service, you now have that ability as well. And so this idea of portability is something that is an important element, not just of an identity system, but frankly also of a system devoted to sharing and connecting. The other point is ultimately, for control, you have to be able to control who you share and connect with. And I think there's a profound set of confusions around this as well. We offer at Facebook lots of different ways and lots of different opportunities to decide when and who you share with. We offer settings when you sign up as defaults, and I understand that there are people here who disagree with the way that the defaults are set, but as a voluntary service, as a service that's expressly designed to promote sharing and connection, we encourage people to share and connect. But of course, we make it very easy for people who don't want to share and connect to limit it. So more than half of the people who've signed on or used the service over the past year have changed the settings in a way that suits their personal needs. Another related point is the defaults or the settings are not always set to be the most open possible. If you put your email address on Facebook, that's not shared with everyone. That's restricted by default only to your friends. You can change that if you want. If you share photographs on Facebook, they're not set so that anyone can see them. They're set so that your friends and your friends of friends can see them. Some people want their photographs to be shared with the world. They're very proud of their photographs. Some people want their photographs to be seen only by their friends. We make that possible for them to do as well. These are controls that I think are important elements of what the true meaning of self-determination should be. The third element that I would say in terms, well, as another element of control, I should be clear, that we constrain the ability of third parties to get access to the data without people's permission. So that the examples that Michael was describing of scraping of data, et cetera, is something that we prohibit. It's not something that the information can come and be captured by people who are playing by the rules. Now, of course, surreptitious things can happen on a computer system that we offer or anyone else, but the rules of the internet and the rules that we operate under are designed expressly to prevent your information from being shared with people you don't want it to go to. The third element, overarching element, that I want to talk about is transparency. Again, it's the point that Merritt mentioned. And here I'd really just talk about two specific elements that I think are important to unpack the concept of transparency. The first is the idea that you have to understand what the rules are. And we work, I think, pretty hard to help communicate those. And we've done some things that we're actually pretty proud of. So of course, we, like everyone, have a privacy policy. We work very hard to make the privacy policy as clear as it can be. It's not in our interest to have people not understand it. But of course, what we do is we, as a service that innovates and introduces new features pretty regularly, we're sometimes required to change the policy to accommodate new features that we're offering. We don't change our policy without giving notice, but also the opportunity for all of our users to comment on our policies. And in fact, we have a mechanism where our users vote to approve or reject changes that we are seeking to make to our privacy policy. I'm not aware of any major internet provider, internet company that offers a similar mechanism of accountability for changes, not just to privacy policies, but to other site governance requirements. The other thing that I think is important for transparency is the idea of really giving people the opportunity to see how their information is used. And that's something else that I think we take very seriously, and we've developed tools and we continue to develop tools on. So one thing that we've had for feature that the service has had at least for 3 years is the ability for any user to come and see how their profile looks to any of their friends or to anyone on the internet who's not their friend, so that they can see what information is being made public and what information is being shared with which group of friends. Another system that we've also recently introduced is that the ability for people to see which of the applications they've approved are obtaining their data and what data they're obtaining, and when those applications last obtained the data. So this idea of an audit trail, as it were, so that people can see the applications that they've previously agreed can access their data for a purpose that they've approved. But if they want to monitor whether that approval, whether that use is appropriate, we give them the opportunity. And of course, if people are not comfortable, we provide an easy mechanism for people to say, I don't want that application to be receiving any more of my data. And finally, the last point I'd say is something that's also very transparent is we do operate, and the way we finance our operations is through an ad system. And the ad system is also transparent, so that any user, anyone in this room can go and see the kind of aggregated data that's made available to a potential advertiser to make sure that no personal information about any particular user is made visible, only broad categories of demographic or other interest information, so that people can see. And of course, if they're not comfortable with it, with how this might apply to their personal information, they can, as I said before, go back and delete that information. And that information would then become removed in its aggregated form. They would no longer be part of the category. It would be part of an ad system offered to a potential advertiser.
Thank you.
So I'm just, this is why I began with my conclusion. So as a practical matter, my point is really, I'm ending with Michael's point, and that is the technologies that we're making available are designed to advance this principle of self-determination, and I think over time will increasingly address some of the additional or new issues that are coming up. Thanks.
I'm quite sure we'll be able to unpack some of that in our question and answers. The last thing I was going to do before opening it up to wider discussion was ask if Kim could now begin to show us what he sees is at least part of a solution to some of the issues that have been raised here. We've all spoken for much longer than our 5 minutes. Kim will have the floor now, but I think I am going to shorten the within-panel discussion because I suspect that we've really wound the audience up so that they're going to want to ask us questions for much of our time. So Kim, over to you first.
I can take a hint, Malcolm. Sorry? I can take a hint. Yes, and I certainly will try and speed up. Okay, so first I'd like to make the distinction between identity and digital identity, and identity being the fact of what you are, and digital identity, in the way that I use it, being something very specific, how the web and the virtual world recognize us when we're in different contexts. So in this sense, it's the foundation. Being recognized is the foundation for personalization. It's the foundation for collaboration, social phenomena. And if you wish, it's like the equivalent of having a mouse or a keyboard on your computer, except that the computer can now recognize you as someone who has used it before. It's also, and this is one of the problems that we face together, the foundation for profiling. And that's really something that I'm going to try and examine more deeply. To set the stage, we have not only a social problem, but an architectural problem. The internet was not designed with any way to know who you're connecting to or who you're relating to. And so, although I totally support the notion that much of what we do on the internet can and should be done anonymously, as much as possible, in fact, I'll go further. We also have the right to know who we are dealing with at moments where that is key, and to make sure that our resources really do belong to us. Now, in the past, given the fact that there is no architecture for identity, let's look for a minute at what people used in the past. And they used essentially identifiers. So names, numbers, addresses that were hung on a physical, natural person, let's say. And those numbers or identifiers were keys into profile data. In the early days of computing, all of those keys were different. They were just local to some system. But as the internet develops, the probability also happens that those keys can get reused, so that across multiple different systems, the same key is employed. An example being an email address used to identify your account. And so once you have that kind of key, and I'll give some other examples, your social security number, of course, or your credit card number, or the MAC address on your computer. So there are many different identifiers like this. Those keys then can form the basis for assembling profiles across multiple contexts. And a number of us in the industry, from many of the different companies who really believe in building the virtual world as part of our mission at this time in history, are really concerned about the fact that these identifiers provide the mechanisms for assembling really vast, detailed, endlessly rich profile stores that not only reveal a lot, but ultimately can end up determining how you're treated. So it isn't simply, I mean, the problem of information leaking is serious. The problem of having your opportunities constricted, restricted, and so on is especially problematic. And so one of the things we wanted to do was to go away from this use of identifiers. Basically, my view is identifiers are evil. We should avoid them whenever it's possible to avoid them. If we have to use them, we should only use them in a very restricted context so they can't be linked up. So, but as I say that, I'm sure some of you will be going, well, gee, if we don't have identifiers, we can't do anything. We can't, we can't recognize people. We can't tell who they are. How can we do anything without identifiers? And our view is that we move towards what we call the claims-based model, where instead of having an identifier, you have the information necessary to do a transaction. So, for example, if you want to do a banking transaction, well, then you probably will have your bank account number. But that identifier is there to accomplish the transaction, the specific transaction. That identifier won't be used in other transactions. It will be used only when you're dealing with your bank, etc. So the notion there is to move away from identifiers and say, what are the claims that are necessary in order to receive a service? The claim might be that you're of a certain age. The claim might be you're of a certain nationality. That you have a certain role or financial status. But if those claims can actually be believed, then in many cases, the association with a natural identity is no longer of any relevance whatsoever. What's relevant is the claim. In the old world, we needed the identifier to believe the claim. In the new world, we can have the claim and scrap the identifier as detritus from the last century. The claims, for example, and they could be identifiers like email addresses, they could be computed things like a person's age is over some level. These claims are signed by the party making the claim. So they can be believed. It's possible to tell where the claim comes from. And so the basic model is when you want to use an application, it tells you which claims are essential to the transaction, and you can go to a claims provider and obtain those claims for the application. And you don't have to do this manually. You could do this through software. So the essential thing here is, therefore, you'll notice in that picture I just showed you, the user is at the center. The person is at the center. It's user-centric. The person has direct control over passing the claim, as opposed to systems in the back reaching out and pulling information out willy-nilly. So there are huge advantages to putting the user in control. Now at the same time, you have this system, it has this great benefit of reducing the promulgation of identifiers, but it also has a big problem. The problem is that if you reuse the same claim provider over and over again in different contexts, that claim provider has a view onto everything you do. It has a panoptical view. And so it is able to construct the super profile of superprofiles, the big daddy super profile, which therefore makes the fact that you're not giving out identifiers basically worthless. And so then the question becomes, okay, if we want to go and actually deal with the threats inherent in the system, how can we prevent that panoptical view? And so the important news is that there actually are technologies that were referred to by Lee that allow us to prevent that all-powerful, godlike view on the way your information is used, and to minimize the information released. And I'm going to give you just a quick run-through. The identity provider issues a set of claims, and you see that little gold thing. That means they're signed, so they can be verified. Those claims are given to people who want to gain access to resources. Then later, when they want to do a transaction, the conditions of the transaction are determined. And of the claims, all of those that aren't necessary for the transaction can be eliminated without invalidating the signature. So it's still possible to prove that this came from the party who was able to know, for example, that this person was over 21. And you'll notice that the date of birth has been changed from a concrete date of birth of, some specific date to just a statement that puts you in a very large category. And so that's part of the way the systems can work. And so then later, when the user presents that set of claims, and this is absolutely revolutionary, the identity provider has no visibility into where the claim is used. And even if the party that receives the claim collaborates with the identity provider, they can never determine which specific user was involved unless the user released a claim like their name. So it now becomes conscious. It's no longer, there are no longer hidden, dirty artifacts of the system that reveal identity in unintended ways. And so I'll give you two scenarios. They're both extreme, and one of them is there are two ends of a spectrum. One is to show that this will do everything that previous identity systems do. Suppose I want to go and renew my birth certificate, get a new birth certificate because I lost mine. I could use my EID in order to get a new copy of the birth certificate, and I'll give you, this is sort of the type of experience. I could go to the website responsible for my birth certificate. It will say that to get a new certificate, I need a bunch of information. You can see that it's very extensive information. A surname, given name, date of birth, street address, and so on. If I approve that, the site will give me my birth certificate. But notice that everything that is revealed here is necessary to complete the transaction. So when we say minimal disclosure, we don't mean that nothing is disclosed. We mean that what is disclosed is kept to the absolute minimum. And I'll close with this last one, which is the same person wants to go to a dating site. Now, of course, many people, when they go to a dating site, would actually like to know that the person they're dating is of the sex and age that they think they are. Normally, more or less impossible to know. But with this type of system, Alice can reveal and confirm her age and her sex without revealing her identity to the party who she is interacting with. In other words, she's not in any way giving up her anonymity by making the claim of her of her age and her sex. So that's the basic concept. I guess the summary is this architecture was designed to enable privacy and minimal disclosure by providing alternatives to identifiers. All the computing platforms actually now support claims. Claims make it possible to limit information disclosed. They don't guarantee it'll be limited, and that's where the other panoply of solutions is necessary around regulation and everything else. And so the next step is this last technology that I told you about, this minimal disclosure technology that will prevent the different parties in the system from having undue visibility in the way that identity can be used. And so through this technology, I believe that we actually can build a system where the concerns, the totally legitimate concerns Lee expresses, can be addressed.
Kim, thank you very much indeed for taking us through that, and there's just so much more to show. What I'm going to do next is, because Lee was the first person asked to speak, I'm going to ask a question of Lee as a little bit of a warm-up, and then we're going to have the microphones available in the room for other people to begin to ask their questions, and we'll take the discussion from there. So, Lee, sorry, I was going to ask you a question. Yeah, sorry, that's all right. You've now heard Michael give some of the answer that he thinks is available. You've heard Elliot begin to say he thinks there's actually more controls available than perhaps you thought that there were. We've had Kim describe to us a lot of technology that would appear to break apart the various players in the game. And I want to have you tell us whether you've been reassured at all by the last half hour, because then we're going to ask similar questions of the audience.
Reassured would be far too strong. I'm not a pessimist, but I think I am a realist. And but one thing I am not is I'm not a computer scientist. So
no, but I'm a pessimist.
Okay, good. But what I do know about the technological solutions is that there seem to be unsolved problems in trying to make these things work. And that's, you know, folks at EFF, you know, we're big lovers of crypto. We've been talking about, you know, the promise of true anonymous digital cash and how wonderful that would be for many, many years. And the fate of anonymous digital cash is really sort of a good, I think, cautionary tale for thinking about the idea that technology will innovate us out of the kinds of problems that I see. First of all, it is not an easy thing to do technologically. There are often, you know, we championed the anonymous browsing system Tor. It's not perfect. With enough collusion that it can be compromised. It's got latency issues. There's an enormous amount of traffic data that's very, very hard to deal with in the everyday world. I mean, this is hard. Transport is a hard problem. The sort of things that we looked at in the NSTIC, it seemed to us that in order for them to do what they wanted to do, they were assuming the solution of numerous unsolved technical problems. Among the deepest is what the security expert Steve Belvin calls buggy code. I mean, there are a lot of things you would like to be able to trust. But as long as your code bases are vulnerable, you have simply pushed the problem into a different layer. If you can't trust the hardware and the software you're running, then it's not clear you can really trust the protocols that are there. So I think that, so I'm not sold. The other part of it, though, and again, I'll go back to digital cash. You have to look at the incentives. I mean, I started to talk about the incentives, right? But but I thought I would not say everything. And fortunately, Malcolm gave me a chance to add to that. When you look at what governments are doing in this area, at least the U.S. government has many, many incentives that do not map well to protecting my privacy or your privacy against any kind of surveillance. Indeed, even as we speak, we are watching the FBI push for backdoor encryption systems throughout our telecommunications infrastructure, which will not affect only us, but the entire rest of the world's communication infrastructure. And that is not going to help any of the things we're talking about. By the same token, though, while I'm really glad that Microsoft is doing this kind of work in the area, I see almost no hint of this kind of innovation in things like the NSTIC. I want to see vendors who have solutions of any sort, even if they're not complete, go out and sell them to government. Sell them, show the government that it can be technologically done, that you could have mass transit systems using some kinds of anonymous smart cards that aren't keeping travel histories, that toll collection, that all of these systems can be done in an anonymous way. I am not sure we are seeing that being sold. And if it's because they don't think governments want to buy it, I can tell you that no government is going to buy it because I told them they should buy it. They might think differently if Microsoft told them that. I don't know.
Thank you, Lee.
You know, the very, very last point I'll make is that in all of these kinds of systems, you need to have accountability. And this is going to be difficult to do, even at a political level, because a lot of policymakers, at least in the United States, are really not very, very technologically savvy. And it is really hard work to get them to understand what really can be done. It's also really hard for the American public to understand what really can be done, what the problems are in the first place. And when you don't have that kind of grassroots, real demand for these kinds of things that those of us in this room might actually value, then it's an even bigger problem. So
thank you, Lee.
That's my level of assurance.
Thank you. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Lee. So we have a panel here that hasn't convinced itself yet. We have two hands in the air already. I can see Stephanie won the race. Stephanie Perrin at the corner here. A microphone is about to progress down to the front.
Thank you. If I wait a second, it turns on, right? Is it on now?
Yes.
Lovely. And first I'll establish my old fogey status. It seems to me, I'm cynical because we've been watching this such a long time. For those of you who were at the OECD meeting on Tuesday, I guess that was yesterday, 1992, the Privacy Committee invited 4 experts, David Chaum, Andreas Fitzman. I was dismayed. I just Googled. I didn't know he'd passed away. So we've lost a great leader there. But there was 4 of them, and I can't remember all the names, to talk about anonymous communication systems. Yeah. And there's no wretched market force bringing these things in. You know, 94, Peter Hustings hosted the Privacy Commissioners Convention. We had David Chaum demonstrating anonymous road toll. Who wouldn't want anonymous road tolls? And it's gone. I mean, there isn't even any interest. I'm glad to see Tor still up, but, and I mean, I guess I would like the panel to address that fundamental question that I asked Zero Knowledge when I was interviewed for the job of CPO at dear old Zero Knowledge. There was a market failure. I said to Austin Hill, okay, once you've sold a copy of the anonymizer to all the cypherpunks, who's going to buy it next? So forget about whether the government has different interests engaged in whether you have anonymous buses and anonymous rail tickets. How do you get the people to understand what's going on?
I'm going to ask Kim to answer first, then I'm going to ask Elliot to give us some thoughts.
Okay. I certainly don't want to come across as, an unbridled optimist myself, okay? So I'm going to crawl onto this pessimistic bandwagon, and It's hard to do. You know, some things are hard to do. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be done. The situation is radically different. I mean, it's completely different from what it was 20 years ago. You know, Microsoft is still, it still is larger than Facebook, isn't it? Yes, it's in the same league anyway.
Not bigger than Twitter, though, probably.
Not bigger. Anyway, major technology companies like IBM and Microsoft are putting, you know, millions and millions and millions of dollars into this. They never did that in 1992. It sounds like we should just be able to turn this stuff out next year, and when I went to Microsoft, I used to believe you could do that. But like producing this stuff and then getting it into these systems that end up going to, you know, hundreds of millions or billions of people really takes a long time. And so I think people should have some, I'm not asking you to be patient because we're in a crisis, you know, around this stuff, I agree. But it does take time. And then around the notion of trying to sell this, we are definitely, there are some very interesting projects happening with governments right now. There are, so, you know, we could talk offline about some of these things. And I'm hoping, and I believe, we will see more and more of them, because I think it's a dialectic here. The consciousness of privacy wasn't there within government. It was more or less, you know, yes, you had the privacy commissioners, but it wasn't something that really extended into the political forces more widely. I believe that is happening now as the whole, as it becomes more apparent to everyone, including my mother. That this privacy thing is a real problem. And so, yeah, I still feel that we have to look at this as a process, as a dynamic. You have to get all these pieces out into the technology infrastructure. You know, once it's a universally available part of the infrastructure, who knows? Facebook may find ways that they can use it and you know, boost off that. Same with other companies. So that's what I see happening, and I have to argue that we really are trying to sell the ideas and sell the projects, and we do think that we are going to get there.
Thank you, Kim. I'm certainly seeing some glimmers in a few places, but it always does come down to who's going to make money out of this. There's no question of that. But I think we're also seeing some models coming up that suggest there are going to be new ways of making money out of this, which is why there's so much promise. Or lose less money, indeed. Lee, I did say, sorry, Elliot, I did say I would.
So I'll be truly
ask you
brief.
to make a remark.
I'm uniquely ill-qualified to do this, A, because I'm not a technologist, and B, I work for a company that's all about helping people communicate their identities. But I will make one sort of editorial comment, and that is, I think that the point that was made earlier, I think it was Lee who made this point. This is a conference about privacy, and one of the points here about, you know, if we want to build a culture that enshrines or protects anonymity, we need to create accountability in those who would seek to violate anonymity. Facebook is a service that's about identity. It's a voluntary service. It does not mean, and it is not our ambition, to prevent people from being anonymous in other parts of the internet. And I think the idea of building protections for the use of information, whether it's obtained from Facebook or elsewhere, to protect people from having that information used by parties, particularly by governments, in ways that were not permitted, expected, intended, I think is exactly the role that I thought the data protection authorities were designed to, you know, created to advance.
So I have one sentence on an optimistic view. I think the German situation is probably not transferable to the US situation, but we will have an identity card now with some credential technologies inside. It's not the fully flavored credential system or minimal disclosure system I envision, but we will have something which can be the hook for e-commerce, for other things, and perhaps we can be a driver also for the US ideas, having that in the right way. But Lee was totally right in pointing out that there are many unsolved problems, and it's also about how to deal with the card, who to transfer passwords or so, credentials, pins, something like that. And therefore, Facebook's a question for that I should always give my email password, that it accesses my email address list, is not very helpful. I think nobody should ask for other passwords. Okay, so that's a merely a mental model that people should be taught to keep their password on their own and not giving it out, even not to a trustworthy service, perhaps.
Indeed. Now, I did see hands go up. Oh, there's two hands there, then we're going to cross to the other side of the room. We won't forget you. So, over there, please. John Borking, then J.C. Cannon, and then there was a couple of hands over here.
Well, thank you for your excellent presentations. We know this problem is quite old. Stephanie already pointed out to that. Is there one solution possible that we try to reach for a ISO standard on identity management? Now it's very puzzling because a lot of people, when they have to show their identity, sometimes they only give their name and email address, others ask for passport numbers, and others ask for a long list of all kinds of characteristics. Wouldn't it help if we just have a worldwide standard on identity management and on identity systems? So at least the user is then common to the same kind of rules everywhere.
So your question is it time to start the international standard of some sort on identity management? Is there anybody who's game enough to answer that question?
It has started already, and there are several approaches, but they are, of course, very general. So every current identity provider wants to be covered by the definitions. So, right? And many of those who develop the concepts don't believe in ISO.
What was that?
If I could,
very briefly, Lee.
Very briefly. I don't think that I think that there's a lack of, again, folks who are doing identity, they're in the business of doing identity. If we're starting from the position that I think some of us share here, maybe all of us, that the default in the world ought to be you don't have to show identity, then the identity folks are always going to be part of the problem more than they are part of the solution. And
that doesn't follow.
Well, let's put it this way. In the Bay Area, when I run and ride BART, I use a magstripe card that has no identity whatsoever. It's just a thing that has cash in it, and that's all. That's like the most easy solution to the problem of identity management in a transit system, because it doesn't care who you are in the first place. And yet when folks innovate into the next generation of system, it's smart, and all of a sudden identity is all over the place. I'm not sure why it has to be that way, but and I'm sure the systems we're talking about using crypto can be great, but if I want a system that moves people, that the system gets paid for, and that's what it does. We had it 30 years ago.
Kim, did you want to make a quick remark on that before we move to the next question?
I think we have different ways of using the word identity. And I think you're talking about identifiers, and I'm not. So you're saying, and I think most people in the identity world are moving away from thinking of identifiers towards thinking of claims. Now the claim could just be that you have a subscription to ride the metro or the subway, like I have in Paris. And it can be such that it doesn't use the same, through this zero knowledge stuff, it can be such that it doesn't use the same identifier each time and doesn't leave the linkage between all of the different places you visited. So we see that as identity. And so when I talked about minimal disclosure, what I mean is teaching the next generation of people who build systems to ask, what is the minimum? Exactly what you're saying. What is the minimum that needs to be released, if anything, in order to accomplish the goal?
One of the interesting things that I think we're only just discovering is that by fastening or focusing down onto a minimum number of identifiers, what we've actually done is create a new value proposition to the bad guys. And so what we've done is protect these identifiers with greater armour, which has actually given them greater value in the economy, which means that they become even more valuable to steal, which therefore means they need to be protected even more strongly, and we're back to an arms race of ever stronger processes on a reduced number of identifiers, and I think we're now discovering that's a ridiculous logic to follow, and that we will therefore go out to, instead of relying on a small number of claims, a very wide range of claims that are fit for purpose in the right context, exactly as Kim described, because first of all, that destroys the value proposition to the crooks, let alone to the governments. JC, you had... JC's
Microsoft,
been very keen. Yes.
I want to recognize Casper Bowden, first of all. Today, if individuals want to stop being targeted with behavioral advertising, they can easily opt out. But it appears that ILIT's model is, if you don't like behavioral targeting, then delete your data, which seems to go against that model and almost brushes up against what Eric Smith said, if you don't want to be in their mapping program, just move. And so I just wanted to get clarification on that from Elliot.
I'm not sure I understood.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm sorry. Going back to initially, you said if people don't like being targeted within Facebook for advertising, they can delete their data.
But my point was, you're absolutely right. Look, I'm not going to be defensive about it. We're a free service that funds our existence by advertising. So there's no question that the model as it exists today is that when people come to our service, the exchange as it is that they agree to accept anonymized advertising. But there's no personal information that is transferred. No personal information ever goes to an advertiser. It's anonymized, demographic-based interest ads that are on there, that appear on their screen. But you're absolutely right. I am saying if people are uncomfortable, actually, but the other point that you suggested I said I didn't say. I'm not saying that they need to delete their data. They can delete their data from Facebook and they can take their data somewhere else. But I don't view that as a privacy issue, because I don't view the data that's being used for advertising purposes as personally identifiable information. It's anonymized data. It's just like saying if you want to buy a newspaper without ads, don't buy a newspaper.
But the ads aren't targeted in a newspaper.
Sure they are. Sure they are. Come on. You don't think that the people who buy Sports Illustrated in the United States are targeted in a different way than the people who buy USA Today? Of course it's a different kind of targeting.
We must move along. I think we've been given another 10 minutes to go, and I haven't let the people on this side of the room exercise any questions at all. So there's a gentleman at the back here who's had his hand waving for a long time.
So I'm Steve Bellovan, for those who don't know me. I have grave doubts about the manageability of a lot of this stuff. My own research on usability of multiple identity systems. I've got some preliminary research results on how people don't understand Facebook's privacy settings. Is there a solution to this? What do we do about that?
So yeah, it's an awesome question. It is the only question. Is this doable? With respect to Facebook, with respect to anything, right, that we're talking about, is an information secure, privacy noteworthy identity system feasible? And my answer is I hope so, and we're working on it. There are probably 6 or probably 3 or maybe even only 1 venture-backed privacy companies in the world right now. And we are trying very hard to create an ecosystem where we are demonstrating that you can make money selling privacy, to give lie to the myth that people will not pay for privacy. We've shown that they will. So that the investment community will get used to the idea that there are reasons to invest in profit-making enterprises that are designed effectively to enhance your privacy and to establish your identity as a manageable system. I don't know that a unified privacy vault with 1 key and many doors on the outside is feasible. That's a very practical and tactical level question to your answer to your question. But I do believe something is going to happen and something's going to give. And I'm going to make a prediction, which is that if we don't succeed now, I mean, now is the time. This is a very important, very sensitive moment. If we don't succeed now, then information will be replaced with disinformation. So we have not talked about disinformation yet. People will lie a lot more than they do now. And there will be, within 5 years, businesses that are on this panel or similar panels around the world that are going to be built around creating a disinformation for you, so as to muck up every business model based on any kind of behavioral advertising or any kind of targeted delivery of service, however possible. So disinformation will replace information as a new business proposition. Now, having said also that, I want us to stop talking about behavioral ad targeting, because it is missing the forest for the woods, or missing the forest for the trees. Behavioral ad targeting does create and catalyze significant problems. I'm on the record saying this in many places, JC. I think your question was a good one. But I'm not worried. My wife wants to see Manolo Blahniks and I want to see Nikes. Doesn't bother me that I don't see Manolo Blahniks and she doesn't see Nikes. We get the ads that we probably want. It doesn't really bother me. I'm worried about what's happening in 2 years from now. So, or 3 years from now, or tomorrow. The technology exists today to allow a 30-year-old healthy woman whose friends on a social network, not Facebook, with a 60-year-old woman who shares her last name and who suffers from, who likes a page about breast cancer, to tie that one data point about this 30-year-old healthy woman. We're not talking about Facebook. We're not talking about any existing company. Okay, talking about existing technology, no existing company, explicitly. 30-year-old healthy woman. That's data point 1. Data point 2. 30-year-old healthy woman points her browser twice in 1 month to a breast cancer treatment center website. Data point 3, she receives an email about breast cancer. Technology existing today will allow healthcare insurance providers to aggregate and mash up those data points and then to charge a different premium to her than they would otherwise. Technology tomorrow will allow an additional layer of information to be tagged with a video that she might post to her website about her family treatment, her aunt's treatment for breast cancer, will digitally understand through audio recognition and facial recognition both who she is and what she's saying, and then we'll tie that information, though she's been posting that video anonymously, back to her user identification elsewhere on the internet. This is coming as sure as the rain is coming, and our obligation is to stop it much more than our obligation, I think, to stop the behavioral ad targeting, because behavioral ad targeting is the symptom. It's not the problem itself. The cancer is coming. The cancer, when you will be assessed, well, your insurance premiums will be changed, where you will not be able to get a date, where you will not be able to get employment based on these very rapidly, instantaneously aggregated data points. My company, this Monday in Newsweek, big story, we did a full rundown. It took us 30 minutes to do a full rundown, sort of NSA-level data set about the journalist Jessica Bennett, who volunteered for this. And we were able to do a total assay of her, so much so that she was not willing to show her own editors about a third of it. Her own editors. She volunteered for this to show how much we could find about her in basically 30 minutes, so basically runtime for machines. And I urge you to pick up Newsweek, so I guess it's a US edition, to do that deep dive. It's coming, and decisions will be made based on those data sets, much more than they will be made for advertising.
We certainly need to have the Caspar Bowden Memorial question, but is there any other? We're going to only probably have time for 2 questions. Oh dear, oh dear. I'll go to Caspar and think about it.
Well, this is Caspar Bowden.
Exactly.
So I have found this a frustrating discussion. I've been a proponent of U-proof technology for more than 10 years, since Stefan Brands sent me his thesis. And I think we've got to come to terms with the fact that some technologies are better for privacy than others. And yet the ideology of data protection, with a capital D and capital P, is that somehow it's all technology neutral. And there's a basic conflict here. this technology, the cryptographic technology we're talking about, was invented after the main principles of data protection were laid down by lawyers aspiring to technological neutrality, but it just ain't so anymore. And I have some frustration with my dear friends in civil society, because what do they think is going to happen? After mass transit systems are built, after identity systems are built in cyberspace, if they're built using old technology with conventional architectures, they are blueprints for surveillance. At least with this new technology, we have a chance. And I just don't know what you want us to do. I mean, we're trying really hard here, so give us a break and get behind this.
Who's us? I just don't know enough. We say we are trying.
Microsoft is trying really hard, and other technology companies in this area, notably IBM.
Thank you. I believe there are actually regulatory construct answers to that, but it'll take too long to answer it. I think we'd much rather hear from our next question, and if we're quick, we can probably do that one and that one. We're going to do her and then you.
Yeah, I have two direct questions to you as a representative of Facebook. One is whether you could imagine that the Facebook service moves away from targeted advertisement, instead charges every user $1 or $2 for an ad and clutter-free social space. That's the first question. And the second question is, as you claim that your company is very much interested in transparency, would you be willing to have a third-party privacy, very strict privacy zeal body like the German URD, look into your infrastructures and have a look whether the data is really deleted after the 2 weeks or not? Would you be willing to think about either of these two?
Sure. So the first question. First question is, could I imagine that we would charge? So I have a vivid imagination. Having said that, it's not up to my imagination, it's up to the imagination of the people who run the company, primarily the founder, and he's made pretty clear that the core Facebook service is going to be a free service, and that he feels that the experience that we've had so far and the response of people around the world so far has been that, that they are comfortable with the approach that we have today. I would say over time, there may well be other sources of funding outside of charging. I do find it very hard to imagine that we would ever charge for the basic service. So I don't think that's on the horizon today. The second question is, would I think that it would be, would I be willing, or would Facebook be willing, to have a third party come and make sure that we live up to the commitments we make when we say that we delete data? And the answer is an unambiguous yes. And it's called the Federal Trade Commission, and we are regulated, and if we don't honor the commitments we make, we're violating our privacy policy and we're violating the law.
I think he's just thrown out the challenge for you. Come up with Facebook Anon and start it up and see how many takers you have. Export the data from Facebook and join your company. Now, we have a question here, madam. The microphone's coming down.
Actually, it's more of a point to ponder. Being a consultant, I think, outside the box, when I saw the term identity systems, I thought not just systems that are electronic, but also the identity systems that are manual. For example, when I went to a conference in Italy last year, I stayed in 3 different hotels, and my data was handled 3 different ways. One, which my data was taken, swiped directly from the passport. Another one where it was manually entered into a computer system. Another where my data was photocopied. So that kind of data needs to be protected too. I just wanted to see what y'all's thoughts on that was. And I'm sorry I said y'all.
It's probably just telling us how immature our current systems are and that we're still struggling. I don't know that we've got a more profound answer to that, I think. Now, I was going to ask if our chair would like to make any remarks before we close. She's taken a long time between words.
Okay, the final words will come from Malcolm, of course. but I will have the pre-final words. I think we had so many different topics that we couldn't handle one with the necessary depthness, but anyhow, I think there are many strands now to go on, and perhaps you are at least encouraged to address individual people from this panel. I will do so too. I think the informational self-determination concept in Facebook does not match that well, as Elliot told me, but it's too detailed to do it in one day time here. But we will have more conversation, I'm for sure. And on the credential concept, we will also have more conversation. We probably are on the same project on that. And Reputation Defender and the US concepts, they are also very much interesting for us. And people from the US call us, have you read this stuff? What do you think of that? And so there will be some boundaries or some possibilities to give input, and also it's very nice to have the other cultures present to understand a little bit more. And now I would like to hand over to my ex-colleague, Malcolm.
Thank you very much, Marit. Well, I think we started out wondering whether our major challenge was from Big Brother or many little brothers, and I think we still don't know the answer. I think we have heard that we're refining what the question is. What does it feel like to be in a world that is safer, where we can manage claims, can manage identity? I think we've made actually quite considerable progress in the last 5, 6, 10 years in that conversation. We are beginning to see some technological answers coming through. I'm personally, unlike some of these people, immensely optimistic about the future on this, but interestingly enough, it will come down to the business model. I do think those are emerging as well. Thank you very much indeed for turning up. May we thank our audience and our panel. Thank you. See you again.